Today we're going to be looking at sparkling wines, and we're going to quickly look at the method of production. We're all very much aware of champagne, and champagne it's confined to a certain area. So nothing outside of the area that the grapes are grown in that are actually certified champagne can be called champagne. And the method of production is called Méthode Tradionnelle. So that means it's a bottle fermentation, a secondary bottle fermentation in the bottle. So what happens is they make a base wine, pick the grapes, usually out of Chardonnay, Pinot Noir, Pinot Meunier, and there's about 4 other legal varieties that are allowed in the region of Champagne. They make it into a base wine, about 11%. Then they put it into a bottle with a little bit of sugar and some yeast, and there's another fermentation in the bottle developing about 1.5% alcohol and all this natural CO2, and it's retained in the bottle. That's how you make champagne. You can make Méthode Traditionnelle wines in other parts of the world, and in France they're known as Cremant, like Cremant de Bourgogne, Cremant de Alsace, and there are different varieties typically of that region, and they have to be aged for 9 months on the lees in the bottle, the dead yeast. Whereas champagne, you have non-vintage, which means it has to be 12 months in the bottle aging on the lees, the dead yeast, and then another, but you can only sell non-vintage champagne after 1.5 years, but legally only aged for 12 months. Then they disgorge it. Disgorge means removes the yeast from the bottle so you don't have it cloudy in the bottle. You also have vintage champagne, and that means it has to be 3 years on the lees in the bottle, and then they disgorge it, removing the yeast. And in all honesty, vintage champagne is the way to go, because it's the 20% of the very best vineyards. So if you're going to spend money on champagne, you should almost go vintage champagne. That means comes from 1 year. Non-vintage means comes from a collection of years. So they'll have up to 80% maximum of one particular year, and then a blend of other vintages that they've held back. It's called reserve wine. And this allows a consistency of house style, which is so important to champagne. That's why when you buy a Veuve Clicquot or Pommery, it's always the same from year to year, because of that house wine, that the reserve wine they've held back. Then you can also have, we call it made like Prosecco. It's tank fermented wine. So you make a base wine the same in a tank, then you take it to another clean tank, get rid of the yeast, then you add more yeast and more sugar, and you ferment it in a tank, and the tank retains the bubbles because you ferment it under pressure, and then you bottle it under pressure to retain all the bubbles, and that's called Charmat method. And that's the aim of that, is really to make fresh and fruity wines, and Prosecco is the absolute classic of an example of that as well. So that's a quick review of the winemaking techniques when you're making champagne or Méthode Traditionnelle or tank fermented Charmat wines.